Today I'm going to rant a little bit about a subject that I think needs to be talked about more. It's Atmos for music. Now, I should say at the outset, I think Atmos for music is bullshit. I think it's a pure money grab and I think it's a grift. And I have a lot of friends who are doing work in that sphere, and I don't mean to impugn their work. I know they're doing it with integrity and doing brilliant work at that. My issues with Atmos for music are really in the implementation of it and the sort of attendant problems that come with labels who co-opt new technologies repeatedly that are known to fail, and they do so in a way that's sort of callous and not representative of the wishes of the artists that are releasing these things. My first big problem with Atmos for music, and really any multi-channel music technology, is that the labels always repeat the same pattern. When the technology becomes available, the first thing they do is they dig up all these legacy titles: Dark Side of the Moon, Sgt. Pepper, Pet Sounds, Kind of Blue, Bitches Brew, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. The list goes on and on and on. They repackage these, they remaster these and repackage these for Atmos, and they try to essentially market them to the technology nerds, the audiophiles for audiophiles' sake nerds, the people who only really care about the format. And these are the people who, if you go into their listening room, they've got every release of Kind of Blue that's ever been released, every mastering, every multi-channel version, etc. These buyers don't care about the music as much as they care about the technology. And when the labels do this, they know they have a guaranteed audience, so it's a bit of a grift. It's a total money grab. They know that they're going to sell or market a bunch of this at one big shot, and they always do it predictably right at the beginning of the technology. My biggest problem with Atmos for music is the way it's implemented with contemporary artists. In the last couple of years, I've worked on so many records that end up being made for Atmos, and what you see invariably is that these artists have no role in the decision making to do this. The labels are essentially forcing them to make these Atmos releases after the record is mixed, and it has no tangible benefit to their career whatsoever. It's not going to increase sales, it's not necessarily going to increase exposure, but the artists have to pay for it. The Atmos mixing process is not inexpensive, and most people don't realize that this is the artist's money. The artist has to recoup this money to pay back to the record label. It's essentially an advance. So when an artist is being forced by a big label to make an Atmos release, that comes against their advance, or it comes against their budget. So the artist is responsible for paying that back, even though in most cases the artist doesn't have a choice in whether or not to release Atmos mixes. That's a huge problem, especially when it has no benefit to the artist. That's a huge problem. Another big problem I have with it is from an engineering perspective. Outfitting my studio for Atmos would be an incredibly, prohibitively expensive procedure. So there are dedicated Atmos mixing facilities and mastering facilities. These are usually very, very expensive rooms that are implemented with very expensive design firms. They have very rigorous protocols for measuring and testing these things. And so there's a handful of approved Atmos engineers now. So invariably, if I mix a record, it's going to go, if it's going to end up on Atmos as well, the mixed version of the record will be released, but then there will also be an Atmos version done by somebody else. And what that requires typically is that I, as an engineer or a producer, I have to make stems of my mixes for the Atmos engineer. Typically, record labels don't really want to pay for that. I'm in the fortunate position in my career where I can demand that they pay me for that. I can just put my foot down and say, I'm not going to deliver stems unless you pay me for the time to make them. Stems are an incredibly boring thing to do. They're the least creative thing you can do in the studio, aside from maybe going to the bathroom. And I can find ways to go to the bathroom more creatively than I can to make stems. They take an inordinate amount of time, and they're just sort of inefficient and not fun to do. And when a label refuses to pay you for that, it's sort of like an extra knife in the back. So we as engineers have to collectively put our foot down and say we're not going to make stems for Atmos without being paid. It has to be that simple. Again, I'm fortunate enough where I can negotiate that and it's not a problem, but the amount of times I've been asked by a label to deliver them at no cost is mind-numbing. It's really incredible. Another problem I have from an engineering perspective is that records aren't being conceived from the beginning to be Atmos releases. So they're being conceived from the beginning to be normal stereo releases, the same stereo format that we've been using for many, many decades. Nobody is tracking a record in an Atmos environment. So from a creative perspective, essentially what Atmos is doing is just simply shoehorning an existing technology into a new technology, but in a completely uncreative and uninventive way. Some people will argue, particularly those who work on Atmos stuff, they'll argue that there are creative ways to do it, and I don't doubt that there are. But the point is that more often than not, the people who made the record, who were creatively involved in making the record, the artists, the musicians, the producers, the engineers, they're not involved in the Atmos versions. So their involvement stops when the stereo record master is finished. That's the end of their involvement. And then those files are turned over to somebody to make their decisions about how it sounds best through many, many speakers or with many channels. This essentially means that Atmos is not a creative technology. We're not exploiting it creatively. It's simply, like I said, shoehorning an old technology into this new technology without any real regard for expression or intent or purpose. It's just done. It's almost like taking a muffin that's really beautiful on its own and then making it 10 times the size and putting a bunch of shit on it just because. That's essentially what Atmos is. It's not a creative technology in that way. It is for film because films are conceived from a sonic perspective in a multi-channel way. Films are a different experience than music, so therefore having them exist in a multi-channel way makes a lot more sense for a viewer and a listener than in the music world, where conceptually we're not thinking about those multiple channels from the beginning, so therefore we're not working creatively with that purpose. So it becomes this thing where the labels are simply doing it, I think, as a money grab and as a kind of a grift to the record buying public to get them excited about music in really callous and sort of uninventive ways. And the thing is, these sort of attempts have failed always. Every advent of multi-channel music technology has failed spectacularly. Dolby Surround, Dolby 5.1, 7.1, DTS, SACD, they've all failed spectacularly, and I don't see any reason why Atmos would be an exception to that. Aside from the fact that potentially it could be fitted into a 2-channel headphone situation, but even then the technology is compromised. It's not quite the normal Atmos experience, and who knows if people even know how to use it. I mean, there are a number of variables in that. But I don't want Atmos to fail, per se. I don't want to perceive it this way. But the way it's being used right now is it's just a callous attempt for record labels to make money and to market while extracting resources from artists who desperately need those resources to make good, valid, creatively expressive records. And the Atmos thing is getting in the way of that in a way that I think is toxic to music, toxic to creativity, and toxic to the livelihood of artists who are making the art. I hope for that not to be the case. Maybe it will become not the case at some point. But as I see it right now, Atmos is pure and utter bullshit. And I think more people need to talk about this because it's, I think, an important topic. So there's that. Cheers.